The Siddhant Shiromani is perhaps unique in the history of mankind as an executive blend of mathematics and poetry. As a mathematician, he frames an algebraic puzzle. As a poet, he evokes the mood of Sringar in the following verse of Leelavati.
I'll just quote you 4 or 5 words which moved me at the very outset, where he talks about India and its past without a memory, without a mooring. That is so true and so tragic. What I will say about the book is that it's timely. I fear we have about 2 decades before we as a people and a civilization are in very big trouble.
That the last 1,000 years was not a story of repeated defeats. It was a story of the greatest resistance in human history. Because many of the other ancient cultures which suffered the same invader, or the Turks and the Europeans, they all died out. We are still here. The only pre-Bronze Age culture that is still alive.
The word Hindu was, it was almost a 4-letter word. It was not something which you mentioned in polite company. We seem to have transcended it. We had become Indian. And it was an Indian which was disengaged again from the past. So when we hark back to the notion of Bharatiya,
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a true honor and privilege for me personally to come here to this August gathering and to be a moderator for this awesome panel, if I may be permitted to say. When Sir called me for the first time and I had a discussion, believe me, ladies and gentlemen, it was like going back to the UPSC days when you were preparing for the interview. Because this book, less said the better, it is an awesome publication to begin 2026. The reason why I say this is that when you go through the pages of this book, every line reflects introspection, it's deep thought, and it's a very deep-seated idea. When I started reading it, you can't read it in a speed manner kind of stuff, not at all. What you need to do is to just sit down and concentrate when you go through the contents of the book. Because there is so much of intense cross-comparison between ideas, concepts, perspectives, that you start to wonder as to how wonderfully ideas, thoughts have been weaved together. When I met Sir for the first time, I asked him, have you been a student of history? He said no. So if he has not been a student of history and if he's been able to bring out this book, I think it is a masterclass for people who want to write about history in the future. I say this not because I have been given the responsibility and honor to moderate it, but it dives into the basic narrative of what could be a probing question, what has remained unexplored as far as our civilization is concerned. It's a very deep dive as far as what was our brilliance, what were our accomplishments across, and what was the reason for the decline. The best part about the book is the chapterization into different topics. I'm sure Sir will talk about it. It's not correct for me to talk about it myself. But the kind of chapterization that he has gone into, where he has compared different civilizations, he's talked about different ideas. He has placed the centrality of India, where he talks about the idea of Bharat. It was something which existed. But what he moans in the book, if I may be permitted to say, Sir, is as to why did we lose track of our brilliance and greatness. That has been very well debated. And what I would like to say, ladies and gentlemen, is if you read through the first few pages and where people have offered comments, Swapan Sir said, the book talks about a new Bharat, increasing awareness of civilizational underpinnings. That was what Sir mentioned. Dr. Sanyal talked about civilization identity through indigenous perspective. And there was also a long quote as given by Dr. Shashi Tharoor. The importance of this book is the analysis of different institutions, the analysis of ideas that, catapulted India into a different kind of greatness. And the reasons as to why we seem to have suddenly lost it. What I could understand, sir, by your writings was that somehow we became complacent. We did not want to look into the outside world and to learn from them. That is the reason why the fissures or the cracks started to appear within our own civilizational entity. Ladies and gentlemen, I can go on talking about it, giving you other insights from the book, because I tried hard myself to comprehend very well as to what sir had tried to, dissect and decode. And I think there are better people to tell you about it. And who better than the author himself? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sir Mr. Shashi Ranjan to come and talk about his book.
Mr. Sapan Das Gupta, Dr. Gautam Sen, Mr. Amish Tripathi, I think he has joined us virtually, Mr. Chaitanya Prasad, seniors, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. I am grateful to you all for being here on a Saturday evening. I extend a warm welcome to you all. Without much ado, let me come straight to the topic. It is my contention that our past is trapped between two competing fantasies. In one, the past is imagined as possessing everything from aeroplanes to atom bombs. In the other, it is a source of embarrassment, dismissed as superstition, ritualism, and oppression. My attempt in this book is to recover the past from these extremes and present it with honesty, its beauty and its failures, its grandeur and its follies, while setting it alongside other great pre-modern civilizations like the Greco-Roman, Chinese, etc. I begin my book with destruction of Alexandria and Nalanda, the two events serving as metaphors for the decline of Greco-Roman and Hindu civilization respectively. I explore our past achievements in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, poetics, statecrafts, etc., as also the spread of the Indic civilization to almost half of the then known world purely through power of ideas rather than ideas of power. Long years of subjugation have buried our collective memory beneath layers of debris. Even when it resurfaces, it does so only faintly. Consider the case of Zero, whose Indian origin is often celebrated but rarely understood fully. Zero appears in several ancient cultures, yet in most of them it served only as a placeholder or a separator. It's only in India that zero became a genuine number capable of arithmetic operations, of behaving like a number in its own right, a genuine number. Brahmagupta's Brahmasput Siddhanta, written in 628 CE, gives the first clear rules for addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division involving zero. Although Brahmagupta was non-committal on division of a number by zero, Bhaskara II or Bhaskaracharya later in 12th century associated such a division with the idea of infinity for the first time in the history of mankind. This shift required a degree of abstraction that few cultures at the time could approach. Negative numbers present an even more striking example. Imagining a quantity less than nothing is difficult even for many today. Yet mathematicians in India not only accepted negative number but integrated them systematically into algebra. Meanwhile, the very culture that carried zero from India to Europe, the Arab mathematicians of the medieval period, could not grasp their significance in any meaningful sense. It never reached Europe. Even zero was only grudgingly accepted in Europe after initial resistance. Florence banned the use of zero in public accounting in 1299 CE, fearing they would enable fraud. Brahmagupta even explored square roots of negative numbers. Though he ultimately declared them non-existent, he came tantalizingly close to inventing imaginary numbers. To understand the differing trajectories of the Indian and Western scientific traditions, one must juxtapose two towering figures, Panini and Euclid. Euclid's Elements shaped the very idea of mathematical proof. Beginning with axioms and definitions, he built arguments step by step, establishing geometry as a purely deductive science. This approach influenced not only mathematics but other disciplines. Knowledge grounded in reasoning alone, independent of observation. Panini, by contrast, shaped an intellectual tradition through grammar. His Ashtadhyayi is a masterpiece of algorithmic thinking, compact rules, layered meta rules, and astonishing precision. Texts by Aryabhat, Brahmagupta, and Bhaskara too show a clear grammatical sensibility. The emphasis is on method rather than metaphysics, on procedures rather than axioms. These contrasting sensibilities deeply shaped the two astronomical traditions. Greek astronomy sought a physical model of the cosmos first and deduced planetary motion from that framework. Their writings contain extensive argumentation and justification for each step. Indian astronomers did not usually describe the physical structure of the cosmos. Instead, focused on algorithms to compute planetary positions with remarkable accuracy. In fact, the Aryabhatiya of Aryabhat can be read as a compact repository of more than 50 algorithms. Underlying this difference was a deeper philosophical divide. In the Indian tradition, the idea of fixed axioms was regarded with suspicion. The consensus in India was, and I am quoting from Vakapadi of Bhartrihari, Upaya nasya niyamo na avasyam avtishthate, meaning rules and procedures are means to a goal. No further constraint or claim of universal validity need be imposed upon them. Observation served as the final arbiter. Greek thought, by contrast, prized universal truths. The consequences of this divergence were far-reaching. India did not fully develop a conceptual model of the cosmos, while the Greco-Roman world was thrown into a philosophical crisis whenever observations deviated from predicted values, for they found it hard to abandon their axioms. This is not to romanticize one or the other tradition. Neither traditions were exclusive, nor they remained static. European science increasingly embraced empiricism through Galileo and Kepler. India, especially through the Kerala School of Astronomy and Mathematics, from Nilkant Somayaji to Jesdeva, moved towards more explicit proofs and derivation. Descartes revolutionized geometry by expressing shapes as equations, and Newton fused empirical observation with mathematical deduction, creating a unified scientific method that has dominated global knowledge since then. The Sanskrit knowledge system functioned through a vast interconnected network across the country and even beyond. Manuscripts traveled astonishing distances despite fragile writing materials and rudimentary transport. Scholars annotated, refuted, and built upon each other's ideas, creating an intellectual empire far larger than most of us can imagine today. This empire of knowledge dominated more than half of the then known world for close to a millennium. What it was like before it fell, I would like to provide only a few glimpses. I would like the audience to take you 900 years back. The year was 1140 CE or so. Alankara, an official of the Kashmiri royal court, was hosting an evening party at his home in Prafarpura, modern-day Srinagar. To celebrate his younger brother, Monk's recently completed epic on Shiva, the Srikanta Charita. What an extraordinary literary gathering it was. 32 scholars were in attendance. Foremost among those present was Ruyakka, Mankha's own teacher, whose Alankara service earned him a reputation as the leading authority on the poetics after Mammat's Kavya Prakash. Also present was Kalhana, many of us know him, the author of Raj Tarangini. Alankara himself was a scholar of some repute. There were others, philosophers, poets, grammarians, and aestheticians, and oddly, one architect. Their presence testifies to the extraordinary cultural vitality of Kashmir during this period. It was not merely a local soiree, it was attended by Tezkant from as far as Konkan and Suhala from Kannauj 900 years back. 10 years later, in 1150 CE, Bhaskara composed Siddhant Shiromani, Bijgani, and Leelavati, some 2,000 kilometers south of Srinagar in present-day Maharashtra. The Siddhant Shiromani is perhaps unique in the history of mankind as an executive blend of mathematics and poetry. As a mathematician, he frames an algebraic puzzle. As a poet, he evokes the mood of Sringar in the following verse of Leelavati. I quote, "The necklace of the young girl in the tussle of pleasure broke. 1/3 of the purse fell on the ground. 1/5 on the bed. 1/6 were taken by her beautiful hair. 1/10 collected by her lover, and 1/6 remained on the thread. O mathematician, tell me how many pearls were on the necklace." Unquote. It is also reminiscent of the liberal milieu in which he operated, where no one seems to have found the hint of sensuality objectionable. A little later, in Sena's Bengal, Jayadeva wrote Geet Govind, a poem often regarded as the most perfectly realized achievement of Sanskrit lyricism. The work unites the delicacy of miniature verbal imagery, so characteristic of Sanskrit poetry, with an overarching emotional and structural coherence. Each stanza, with its sensuous detail and music cadence, contributes to the unfolding drama of separation, longing, and the union between Radha and Krishna. But this millennium of flourishing creativity soon suffered irreversible blows. After Jaisimha, who was the king when the extraordinary gathering in Srinagar took place, Kashmir descended into chaos due to frequent Mongol attacks and eventually came out under the Shah Amir dynasty. Goddess Kashmir Purvasini vanished from Kashmir. There would be no monk again. Prithviraj Chauhan's defeat at Tarai in 1192 opened the Gangetic plains to conquest. Bakhtiyar Khilji destroyed Nalanda, Udantapuri and Vikramshila and sacked Lakshman Sena capital. The Yadavas of Devagiri, Bhaskara's patron, fell to Malik Kafur in 1307 CE. Within a century, the Delhi Sultanate controlled much of India. There would be no Bhaskara again. Only Kerala preserved a continuous scientific tradition into the early modern period. The scale of destruction, material, institutional, intellectual, is still inadequately assessed and often discussed only reluctantly, partly due to politics and partly out of politeness. Temples, vihars, mutts, the institutions that sustained scholarship, art and science were destroyed or declined for the want of scholarship. Patronage, India entered a long arc of intellectual contacts. Toynbee observes that India might not have fallen to Western conquest had it not already been conditioned by centuries of earlier subjugation. Habit of acquiescence became ingrained. The true significance of this decline can only be understood when we realize that it is at this very moment that the West starts moving in the opposite direction. While centers like Nalanda and Ujjain were being torn down, Bologna, Paris and Oxford were rising. Thomas Aquinas was born 25 years after the University of Paris received its charter in 1200 CE. He reconciled Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine, shaping Europe's path towards Renaissance. Centuries of foreign rule prompted me to reflect on India's military failures. Technology, tactics, organization, and political fragmentation all mattered in some degree. But what surprised me most was how easily invading armies used deception to outmaneuver Indian forces. This is striking because deception lies at the very heart of Kautilya's Shastra. The text advocates covert operations, silent warfare, irregular tactics, yet historical India rarely used these systematically. When the Marathas used Kautilian tactics, it brought them considerable success. My hypothesis is that India produced no lasting realist tradition after Kautilya. In 3rd to 5th centuries, the Arthashastra was a big hit, particularly in North India. But thereafter, its popularity seems to have waned quite rapidly. Strikingly, a key Kautilian term, outwitting, used repeatedly in his diplomatic and strategic vocabulary, is completely absent from the Niti Sar of Kamandiki. which is a Gupta period text that is otherwise heavily indebted to the Arthashastra. Kautilya's ideas were condemned by later writers like Banabhatta as immoral, and by 9th century, the Arthashastra had virtually vanished from intellectual tradition, especially in the north. Kingship came to be articulated through Raj Dharma, not the pragmatic Rajniti of earlier statecraft. The wholly autonomous and pragmatic science of earth was subordinated to Dharma. Equally revealing is India's minimal curiosity about lands beyond its borders. Merchants, monks, and missionaries traveled widely, but they did not compose accounts of foreign societies. There was no Indian Megasthenes, no Xuanzang, no Ibn Battuta, no indigenous tradition of cartography or exploration. India exported its idea freely. It was a munificent giver, but a very reluctant borrower. Between Bin Qasim and Mahmud Ghazni, 3 centuries passed. Zoroastrians had fled Persia and taken shelter in Gujarat. Between Ghazni and Gori, another century and a half passed. Yet there was no one in India who was curious to find about this new religion, its holy book, its doctrine. It can be argued that China and Japan had also turned inward like India, but fortunately, in their case, the closure was both ways. They were highly suspicious of foreigners. India shut itself from the world, but at the same time remained fully open to the outsiders. Moreover, when faced with the Western threat, China and Japan reacted more swiftly than India and attempted to import ideas and technology to counter the West. In contrast, the first Indian diplomatic mission to Britain, sent by Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II in 1766 CE, had no interest in Western knowledge or technology. The Mughal Emperor merely wished to establish personal ties with the British king. He seek military assistance to restore him to the throne. His attempt to establish direct relations with George III alarmed Robert Clive, who prevented the letter written by the Mughal Emperor addressed to the British king and the nazr of 1 lakh taka from ever reaching the envoys. Mirza Itsamuddin Panchanuri, who joined the mission led by Captain Archibald Swinton, proceeded to London anyway. It's a different matter that Panchuni wrote Sigurfe Nama-e-Vilayat after coming from England, perhaps the earliest detailed Indian travelogue about a foreign land. When Nepal first set foot in India, he was overwhelmed by the disorder and decay he saw around him. In an area of darkness, he writes with characteristic severity that, I quote, a people with a sense of history might have ordered matters differently, unquote. A sense of history is essential to know what India was and therefore what India is capable of, where India faltered and what should be done not to repeat them. Past is a subject matter of study, not for seeking retribution, not even for creating resentment, for it will be stupid and self-defeating. The book urges, in the words of Shashi Tharoor, and I quote, contemporary India to reclaim not its wounded pride, but its lost spirit of inquiry and self-renewal, unquote. Thank you for your kind passage.
Thank you very much, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, you would now realize why I said it was a masterclass. If you dive deep into the kind of topics he covered, poetry in Kashmir, talking about history, talking about travels, talking about individuals, talking about different subjects. And within 10 minutes, he wrapped off everything else, trying to tell us what this whole book is about. A big hand of applause, warm applause for him. For the simple reason that if you read the book, I'm sure a lot of you have the book with you, it will be deep reading. It has to be read very, very carefully, because if you skip a line, you will not know what is happening next. That was my experience, but if you heard the author himself, you would realize what he has given us. He's given us a full menu to, understand before we start eating it. It's my honor and privilege now to invite to you our next speaker, Dr. Gautam Sen.
Good evening and namaste to you all. I thank Rupa Publishers and Shashi Ranjan Kumar for inviting me to join the panel. Let me begin by saying, Mr. Kumar, if you look at his book, he's a gentleman. I must tell you, I am not. So please forgive me and indulge me if I am being acerbic. First of all, It's a fine book, well written and thoughtful and very well structured, and it's got some lovely plates in the middle. I would say do read it. The subject areas chosen are excellent. It covers pretty much the ballpark. You can quibble about a little here, a little there, but largely, you see, it is balanced and very well thought out. I'll just quote you 4 or 5 words which moved me at the very outset, where he talks about India and its past without a memory, without a mooring. That is so true and so tragic. What I will say about the book is that it's timely. I fear we have about 2 decades before we as a people and a civilization are in very big trouble. And I see before me a very distinguished and formidable writer on this subject, Lieutenant General Shukla. I don't know where we are going to be headed. I'm only grateful I'll probably be gone by then, so I'm relieved. What is happening now is a concerted attempt to thwart the new breed of nationalist historian of the last 2 decades. They saw of Jadunath Sarkar, R.C. Majumdar, and many others. They saw them off. They simply removed them from the curriculum, begun by the likely author of many Nehruvian works, Muhammad Habib, and after 1971, by the CPM and CPI, they basically, had a strategy and they smashed any vestige of realistic appraisal. And again, Mr. Kumar has done a very good job because, he has talked about all the issues, and what matters to a reader is that he's balanced. I'm not in favor of balance, but I think that's what the reader wants. So, again, do read it. Now, what we have seen is intellectual assassination of our history from the 1970s when Mrs. Gandhi did this deal for parliamentary support. And the redoubtable Bengali gentleman, a family friend of ours, was her chief economic advisor, the subsequent finance minister of West Bengal, Ashok Mitra. He was once asked, "Are you a Bhadralok?" He said, "No, I'm a Marxist." So there we have it, the kind of attitude which pervaded. I think this is changing and there is good work coming out, but I'm afraid the other side is a lot smarter than us. They have got a lot more money. And I only say to you, look at the preface of the book by William Dalrymple, Anarchy. Just look at the preface and look at the galaxy of stars he thanks in that book. The number of people who helped him, we can only dream of it. We can get funding occasionally, but we can't match this. This is a very well-organized, concerted attempt, starting from Rutgers to Oxbridge, to thwart this new historical writing, of which people like Hindol Sengupta, Sanjeev Sanyal, Vikram Sampath, Meenakshi Jain are representatives. But by and large, we are losing this battle of the narratives because the quality of work being produced by the opposition is extremely good. For example, the book on Hindu civilization, which even the Kerala RSS celebrated, is a book of magnificent omission. It simply leaves out the Gupta period and argues that the entire antecedents of everything worthwhile in India came from Buddhism. It used to be very Islamic before as far as this author is concerned, but now he has changed his tack. And then there are other authors who are very good, Mr. Pillai, Kanisetti, and his son Sam. All of them writing a different kind of history where basically the significance of Hindu civilization is downgraded. This is war. And I really do believe Mr. Kumar's book is a very useful corrective because it is so easy to read. And again, I say, Hindi version is urgent. Now, one minor issue which I think we should be very concerned about, and this has gone completely out of control in India, is this anti-Brahmanical movement. Actually, they weren't particularly interested in Brahmins at all. They were interested in the repositories of our intellectual heritage and knowledge. Every conqueror lops off the head before they control the body. And this was what motivated the bitter struggle, because these people refused to give up. And this is the miracle of India, that for so many hundreds of years, enough survived. I was reading the Oxford History of India, and there was a chapter in it about how quality of Sanskritic education in Bengal, when the British took over in the 18th century, was very poor. But there were 30 or 40 Brahmins assiduously trying to teach Indian history and Sanskrit. And it makes you want to weep that there was still so much resilience. I would say that we don't have a lot of time, and our heritage is phenomenal. I'm fascinated that Mr. Kumar actually has identified in a few paragraphs how Indian civilization, Hindu civilization was unable to cope with foreign invasions. He has hit the nail on the head. What we lacked is what the Russians were superb at, Maskirovska, and what they employed with magnificent effect in Operation Bagration, where they outmaneuvered the Army Group Center completely, and by that great Marshal Rokossovsky. So this is what we have lacked. We are learning much more. We are better at warfare. Our generals are very smart. I've met a lot of them in my time. And I think we are much more difficult. But we are suffering internal subversion big time across the board. And really, we need to be conscious. And I regret very much that I was saddened by a lovely woman who's from a very distinguished IAS family. A distinguished father was saying to me, but I'm opposed to all extremism. She was equating Hindus and Islamic civilization. This is simply false. We may have many faults, and we should acknowledge them and correct them, but we are not exactly the same. We have not created ISIS and auctioned women. So, I will answer any other questions later on. I would again say, Mr. Kumar has done a great service, and I must say I wasn't quite expecting this to be so good since he's a popular historian. I would only conclude that the Delhi IIT ought to be investigated for straying from its mandate and teaching history instead of electrical engineering. So on that happy note, thank you very much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, what Sir said at the last part, Delhi IIT should be investigated. I think that sums up exactly as to what he wanted to say. I come back to the same thing that, if you read the book and you look at the kind of historical instances, references that have been made, if you have been a student of history, you would start to wonder yourself as to how could we miss out this. And it is an unbelievable book, not because I'm doing the moderation, but every time I hear someone speak, it just jogs back to say that you need to read it a lot more carefully. Gautam sir has mentioned to different kinds of historians the kind of analysis, the kind of perspective that was done. It is for us to understand as to what kind of crisis it is and how did Hindu civilization, the reasons behind the problems that we face or we have faced in the past. To take it forward, ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is a very eminent author, Amish Tripathi.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction. Shashi ji, if I may just begin by saying how much I thoroughly enjoy your book, The Decline of Hindu Civilization. And Swapanda and Gautam da, pleasure to connect with you, albeit online. I think Shashi ji has spoken wonderfully of the achievements of Hindu civilization. And our achievements should not be restricted just to the sphere of knowledge. In practically every sphere of human civilization, in the fields of warriorship, in business, in capitalism, in navigation, in institution building, there's a brilliant video I'd seen of Shailendra Mehta ji, who's working on a book on how many Western universities, their conception of what a university should be actually arose from the Indian university system. So the Hindu civilization's contribution to the human journey is really, I say this quite frankly, is actually second to almost none till the recent past. And if we had such great achievements in so many different spheres, the question arises, why did we lose repeatedly over the last 1,000 years? Now, there's one way to approach the story of the last 1,000 years is erase the story of repeated defeats, But I think that would be too pessimistic an approach to take. There is the same set of facts. Yes, we lost battles repeatedly. But with the same set of facts, we can actually have a different interpretation. Practically every ancient culture in the world faced the same invaders that we faced. First, the Turks from Central Asia, and this is an educated audience, you don't know. The Turks were originally not from Turkey, they were actually from Central Asia. And Turkey was among the lands that they conquered and rewrote in a way. So first the Turks, largely the Turks, also the Persians and the Arabs, and then post that the Europeans. It was 1,000 years of really brutal invasions. American historian Will Durant had said that the Turkic invasion of India is perhaps the most brutal conquest in human history. But with the same set of facts, we can have a different interpretation that the last 1,000 years was not a story of repeated defeats. It was a story of the greatest resistance in human history. Because many of the other ancient cultures which suffered the same invader, or the Turks and the Europeans, they all died out. We are still here, the only pre-Bronze Age culture that is still alive. We should be proud of the bravery and courage of our ancestors. It is 1,000 years of perhaps the greatest resistance in human history. But we must also honestly analyze that in the times that we lost in the last 1,000 years, what are the things, what are the areas where our ancestors made mistakes, so that we don't repeat those mistakes. And I wanted to speak briefly on my analysis of the mistakes and set aside, of course, their immense courage that our ancestors had. किसी ने हमारी सभ्यता को खैरात में हमें नहीं दिया है, हमारे पूर्वजों ने लड़ के उसे बचाया है. We must be proud of the courage of our ancestors. But what are the areas in which they made mistakes? One thing that is very obvious is internal disunity. Shashi ji spoke briefly of Malik Kafur, or actually, sorry, the video is going off and on, so I don't know who, but someone did speak of Malik Kafur, who is among the greatest temple breakers in human history. He perhaps second only to Aurangzeb. And this is one of the things that we must consider. So among the things that are worth thinking about Malik Kafur is his name. Malik Kafur, he was a kafir. He was actually a Hindu convert. So among the greatest temple breakers in human history was actually a Hindu convert. And this just didn't happen there are many others who supported, sadly, the Turks. Warriors who were willing to die, Indian warriors, Hindu warriors, willing to die for Turkic masters. This sadly happened. It happened during the British era as well. The British conquered India because of Purabiya soldiers from eastern UP, Bihar, Bengal. They used them to defeat the Punjabis and Pathans and Marathas. And then post 1857, when the Purabiyas rebelled, they used Punjabi and Gurkha soldiers to defeat the Purabiyas. Essentially, Indians and Hindus won India for the British. And we didn't just have internal disunity and traitors within the fields of warriorship. Jagat Seth, the great, among the wealthiest businessmen of the 18th century, actually funded Robert Clive's army. And so many times our own businessmen, actually, our own businessmen who supported the biggest drug smuggling racket in human history, which was Queen Victoria's British Raj, when they did opium smuggling into China. Indian businessmen, sadly, some Indian businessmen supported them, which actually hurt India also tremendously. Many of the famines were caused by this. So the first thing that strikes in disunity within Indians, how can we control that today? The second thing that strikes me is, did we do enough Purva Paksha, an analysis of the enemies that confront us with a calm mind, not swinging on either extreme? Don't don't think that all religions speak, everyone wants to speak of love and unity, and everything is hunky dory. Don't go on the absolute positive approach. Don't go on the absolute negative approach where you start hating your enemies and don't see the strengths that they have. Did we do an actual calm Purva Paksha? I suspect we didn't do that, which is why we misread our enemies very often. Jagat Seth would probably not have funded Robert Clyde, even though he did it to fight against a very barbaric ruler in Sirajuddaula. But he probably won't have funded Robert Clive if he understood what the British mindset was as well. So, did we fail in Purva Paksha, a calm analysis of our enemies and indeed other people as well? Something Chanakya used to do. And the third thing, we forgot, I think, one of the key principles that Acharya Chanakya spoke of finding common purpose between people who have fundamentally different approaches but are still Indian, or are still Hindu. So, for example, Acharya Chanakya used allied with the might of the forest tribes to fight the Nandas. That's among the things that's taught to us in history. Whereas we Hindus and Indians find almost every reason to keep keep dividing ourselves. The vegetarians against the meat eaters, languages, caste, community. We find every other reason to not find the commonality of purpose, and that there are times when different approaches are required. I'll end with this wonderful example of the samanvay between different groups that I saw in a Ranakpur Jain temple. I wonder how many of you have been to the Ranakpur Jain temple. Rishabh Dev, the founder of Jainism, is there in the Garbhagriha. It's a Jain temple. The entire area is completely vegetarian. Rishabh Dev, Adinath Rishabh Dev, as you can imagine, completely non-violent, completely vegetarian. His murti is there in the Garbhagriha. But at the door of the Garbhagriha is Bhairabnath Ji himself. Bhairabnath Ji, for those who are aware, is an Ansh of Lord Shiva. And we all know Bhairabnath Ji temples, you serve meat, you serve alcohol. He's a very aggressive god. And at this murti of Bhairabnath Ji at the door of the Garbhagriha is showing in his traditional form. He's holding a sword, he's holding a shield, he's holding the cut head of a Rakshas in the third hand. There's a dog under that cut head drinking up the blood, a bit like preventing Raktabij. Think of the partnership. Rishabh Dev, the paragon of pacifism, vegetarianism, non-violence, and Bhairabnath Ji at the door. Essentially, Bhairabnath Ji, in a way, giving a message to Rishabh Dev, आप ध्यान करिए, जब तक मैं यहाँ खड़ा हूँ कोई भी राक्षस अंदर नहीं आएगा. And Rishabh Dev also realizing the value of Bhairabnath Ji. This partnership, how do we ensure that that we can understand each other within the Hindu culture and realize the importance of different groups, even though we may have completely different approaches within ourselves? That only when India survives, only when India is strong, will all of its individual components also survive. Dear thoughts I wanted to.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pati. It was a different perspective altogether, where you try to understand why we lost and what were our shortcomings, etc. You talked about internal disunity, but the key takeaway was the example that you gave at the last instance, the Samanvay group. You're talking about this Jain temple in Ranakpur, you're talking about Rishdev, and you're talking about Bhairavnath. I think that is a very loud and clear message as to how we need to get that cohesiveness back within ourselves. And the point is that how do we get this social configuration moving seamlessly? That is what is the need of the hour. And that is where this book is important as a timely reminder to us as to how do we draw back from the times where we were great and how do we reclaim that lost glory. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor and privilege for me to welcome Dr. Swapan Das Gupta.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me to this book launch of Sri Shashi Ranjan Kumar's absolutely enthralling, stimulating, and, if I may say so, even provocative work. Now, when in his introduction, Chaitanya ji spoke about the fact that he expressed his bewilderment that the author is not a historian. And I would say that it's because the author is not a historian that he has been able to produce such a wonderfully stimulating book on history. Anybody familiar with how, and I think Gautam mentioned it in great detail, anybody familiar with a manner in which the discipline of history has been relentlessly distorted and even massacred over the years, over the decades in India, would marvel at the fact that we still retain some notion of our past. And it's thanks to those who be outside the formal discipline of history that we've been able to maintain some sort of sanity and awareness of what the past is. I'll just give you a small example. This book has some very revealing comparisons. It's a book about India, principally about India, but it's not exclusively about India. It draws analogies of the Hindu civilization with other civilizations. The Chinese, for example, or the Romans, how they functioned, etc. It's a miracle that, such comparisons are still being made in India. Because as far as the discipline of history is concerned, as is practiced in India, Chinese history began in 1840, that is the Opium War, reached its climax in 1949, which was when the People's Republic of China was established, and then went on to do greater from about each step from correctness to correctness. They moved on. Now, important as these facets of China are, it does not tell you anything about how the Chinese mind works, how the Chinese personality developed. It tells you about how there is a certain resistance of China towards the West, the aversion. But how does China think? And that's one of the things which comes out in this book. What are the similarities? There is a very nice section about how the notion of monotheism is something completely alien, not only to the Indian tradition, but it is also alien to the Chinese tradition. Whereas you can be a Taoist, you can be a Confucian, you can be something else, even a Buddhist at times. Although there are very serious conflicts, theological conflicts between Confucianism and Buddhism. Likewise in India, and I think Amish was alluding to some of that, the exclusivity of something called Hinduism is a very modern construct. It never existed in the past. Therefore, you can be a Jain. In my part of the world, we can be a Shakta, which people like me are. At the same time, you can have equal veneration for the Vaishnavite tradition, which exists quite in a very vibrant sort of way in the country, in that part of the thing. There are others who are Shaivites. They can be Sikhs as well. the interchangeability between what is called Hindus and Sikhs, which existed in parts of Sindh and Punjab, is very much there. So the exclusive nature of what is called Hindu is a very much a modern construct. It's an artificial construct. So I think it's important to realize when we're talking about Hindu civilization, we mean multiple currents, and that we are not talking about something very exclusive. And that's very important to keep in mind, because of late there has been a tendency, an intellectual tendency, to try and say Hinduism means something of one particular stream. It doesn't. That's a very contrived interpretation. It's a very contrived interpretation. It's also very expedient and politically determined interpretation. Just like you can say that there is no one language in India. The civilization, the Bharatiya civilization, is made up of multiple languages. Maybe most of them have their roots in Sanskrit, but some of them may not have. There is a Tamil which is heavily Sanskritized. There is a Tamil which is almost consciously, which has sort of excluded Sanskrit from its vocabulary. The Bangla I speak, and for which I could understand the Hindi of the All India Radio at one time, which a lot of people in northern India found it very difficult to understand. I found it effortlessly, because the vocabulary was more or less the same, except our sense of gender is a little less defined than that exists in the north. But I think all these facets are important, because the issue of what is Hindu civilization, why did it decline? It's not a modern preoccupation. I spent much of the past, during the COVID interval, trying to look at some of the writings of the late mid-19th to the early 20th century Indian writings. And what was clear from everyone, whether we take Swami Vivekanand in Bengal, or someone like Bhandarkar or Ranade in the Bombay presidency at that, as it were, they were preoccupied with one particular question. Why did India lose its sovereignty? A lot of them also, the question is, when did India lose that sovereignty? That question, of course, becomes unpopular in certain circles now. Some people would like to say we lost it in 1757. Others would say, well, we can date it far back. And we just commemorated the 1000th anniversary of the first destruction of the Somnath temple. So was it as far ago as that? But whatever it is, the preoccupation with what was lacking in us. We had advances of a particular nature. We had huge advances in science, in technology, in forms of trade, a certain awareness of statecraft. But why did it suddenly crumble? And what were the reasons? Is it purely a question of internal disunity, as some people would like us to believe? Some people at that time suggested we are too preoccupied with caste. That was also suggested as a reason. People like Bhandarkar who used to say that we lacked a corporate identity. By which he meant we lacked a sense of nationhood, a defined sense of nationhood. So these debates have been continuing for a long time, and they will continue. The tragedy was that after independence, tragically, when these concerns should have been principally uppermost in our minds, was derailed by a fact that was a break, that we've started something completely different. That in 1947 or 1950 marks an India which is disengaged and detached from the past. It was not entirely so, but it was somehow made out that those concerns were no longer, therefore the question of nationhood, etc., would be redefined in a way. Now that was the manner in which it was looked at. And therefore I believe a certain spurious notion of modernity was thrust on India at that particular point. It's not that we faltered at every point, but I think because of that, we didn't live up to our potential as much as we should have. Because we tried to reinvent ourselves as an Indian who had no sense of history. There's a wonderful speech, a very intriguing speech, which Jawaharlal Nehru made when he inaugurated the High Court of Punjab and Haryana in Chandigarh at that time. And he said, I'm so glad we chose Chandigarh and we made Chandigarh the way it is without any reference for the past. Chandigarh, as we've defined it, marks a new beginning which is untrammeled by anything that was there in Punjab in the past. Now, if that was the sense of modernity, I'm sorry to say, I think it is hardly surprising that we didn't quite live up to what we should have gone. So the issue of actually looking at as to what is Hindu civilization. For instance, the notion of Hindu civilization, 20 years ago, if you mention Hindu civilization, I mean, your job in the UPSC will be slightly precarious. The word Hindu was, it was almost a four-letter word. It was not something which you mentioned in polite company. We seem to have transcended it. We had become Indian, and it was an Indian which was disengaged again from the past. So when we hark back to the notion of Bharatiya, we have to look back at some of these. And I think one of the reasons why the people like Sheldon Pollock talk about the decline of Sanskrit. Now, the book, Shashi's book, has quite an exhaustive section. He criticizes some of the historical approaches of Sheldon Pollock. But I think what was important also to realize is that when Pollock was mentioning the fact that Sanskrit has died, is that Sanskrit as a truly rigorous discipline more or less collapsed in independent India since the 60s. There's a fascinating, there's a very old Dogri manuscript in the National Archives. And if any of you go there, I think the archivist, the chief archivist, will be very proud. We will proudly show it to you. And I went there as a member of a parliamentary delegation. So he pointed out that this is one of the oldest manuscripts we have. We've kept it so beautifully, etc. That's all that is there. So I just asked him a question. When was the last time it was consulted? So he sort of said, well, you see, there were two people who knew this form of archaic Dogri, who could read it. One is an academic scholar in America, and the other was an Indian. Unfortunately, he died. So here we have, again, just like the Arthashastra was discovered about 100 years ago. Not by chance. I mean, there are so many Arthashastras still willing to be rediscovered. How much have we utilized our time trying to reforge the manuscripts which were lost in Nalanda? It's there some of it is there in Nepal, some of it is there in Tibet, but it's got to be translated back. That entire exercise of reclaiming an inheritance has just about begun. I think that awareness is still very new, that we lost it, and let's rediscover it. Otherwise, we are accused of looking back, trying to get an obscurantist view, a very reactionary view of India. But the point is that whether we call it India, whether we call it Bharat, etc., the awareness of our civilization in the 21st century is only still at a very, very tentative stage. And this, despite the fact that we are a very ancient civilization. So when people like Shashi Ranjan Kumar writes this book, he doesn't, it's what I find interesting about this book is not that it gives answers to everything, not that you must necessarily agree with every single conclusion. But I think that for a generalist audience, this is very important. And what has been one of the most striking features in India in the past decade or so has been the revival of generalist history by people who have written histories who are not historians. And they have made history accessible to the ordinary people. What happened was that history was taken out of the reach of the average person, except for those who did UPSC exams and things like that. No, I don't want to bother about that. And handed over to people whose main preoccupation were things like modes of production, abstractions like that. So to bring back the life and soul of history, to ask those very questions we need to ask, that is what it asks the right, relevant questions. And that's the beginning. And from there, if all of us can take it up in our own way, limited interventions, small steps, that's when we can create that awareness. And in building that awareness, while we important to look forward, it's equally important to learn the lessons of the past. I thank you once again, Shashi, for bringing out this fascinating book, which I hope will be translated in as many languages as possible, because mercifully, the language I'm speaking in is on the way out.
According to you, the biggest takeaway from this book, as far as you said, there is a need for civilizational awareness. So would you like it to be focused on a particular section of the population, especially the young generation? What would you like to say on that, sir?
Well, I don't know about the young generation. I'm sorry, I'm past that stage of where I can speak or even sometimes comprehend what the preoccupations of a young generation are. I can only tell you what can be interesting for people. Firstly, as far as history is concerned, I think the importance, the connection of decline and the lack of state power is something which is very important, I find. That you cannot nurture a civilization if you have a hostile state power present. And therefore, the importance of a sympathetic and benign state power, and therefore creating statecraft to suit our requirements, is very important. If you can take inspiration from Chanakya, fair enough. You can take inspiration from anyone you want to. But the important thing is, what is the objective of that? And as Shashi ji has pointed out, if you exclude too much, one of the biggest problems, which I think at one time, the 100 years between the conquest of Sindh, the invasion of Sindh by Muhammad bin Qasim, and the Ghazni attacks, what, 100 years? More than that. 300 years. Yeah, 711 and 1000. 300 years. 300 years when you did absolutely nothing. Your awareness that around that time you had the decline, the fall of the last Shaivite kingdoms in Afghanistan. That had collapsed also. And yet, like the proverbial chess players in Shatranj Ke Khiladi, you busied yourself with playing chess, dissecting, the norms of grammatical norms, while the redcoats came in. So, state power, I think, is very, very important.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Shashi sir, according to you, what was the biggest challenge in writing this book? You have analyzed it so comprehensively, so minutely, and it is so well researched. According to you, what was the toughest section that you had to deal with?
I think the vastness of material, because actually if we think of it, each chapter itself is actually subject matter of one book, more books. So how to comprehend it and give a 10-page or 15-page summary of that, which does not become too commonplace कि ऐसा कि कुछ उसमें कुछ दिखे ही नहीं और इतना ज़्यादा मुश्किल ना हो जाए कि मतलब आम आदमी उसको पढ़ न सके. So for a popular audience, I needed to keep always this balance between the two. And the most difficult chapter is understanding actually it's very difficult. Still I have not understood the full Greek astronomy and Hindu astronomy. Earlier models, the Ptolemy's model and the Aryabhatta model, is very, very difficult to understand the way they did the calculation and accurately predicted the value of Chandragrahana, lunar eclipse, solar eclipse, almost to seconds and minutes. So vastness of material, how to produce it in a manner that is simple for a lay audience was the biggest challenge for me.
So, but in your book, if I may just add, you have given a lot of diagrammatic representations which you were mentioning that you've tried to create for a better understanding.
The Chinese, the Mayans, the Babylonians, all are having system in which they have zero. Chinese represented zero by a blank. There is nothing for zero. The Mayans with a shell. Okay, Mayans is a number system with 20 base. Babylonians have a number system with 60 base. And they have two slanted wedges to represent zero. Now, one unique thing you will see is that, which I think has left which scholars have missed, is that their number representations is still trying to convey the meaning of number. So 1, 2 lines, 3 lines, 4 lines, or 1 line it becomes 5, we put this. First time it is Hindi numeral that it becomes a purely symbol, absolutely abstract. You can use 1 for 2 or 2 for 1. It doesn't make any difference. But that was the abstraction which was actually a quantum leap. Otherwise, with such huge representation, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, how could you write large numbers? So here was the brevity and the genuinity of Indian mathematicians in representing those symbols through absolutely abstract symbols.
Okay. Gautam Sen sir, wanted to ask you that you've taught in the London School of Economics. Would you suggest a book like what sir has written would be of benefit for better understanding of Indian civilization or Hindu civilization in an institution like LSE?
A brief answer, it won't make any reading list. A very fine book on Kashmir was written by the late Ambassador Chandra Dasgupta on Kashmir. And he had actually gone to London and it looked at the archives, which were promptly withdrawn after he had made photocopies of everything. That book never met any reading list in my department, International Relations. I mean, this is all very ideological. So, ये बात तो ऐसी है, it won't change. They will not allow books which question. Even in Delhi University, there is no Venkat Dhulipala in the reading list. That is astonishing. It is one of the finest books of political history in the last 30 years. It is not there. So this is all political. We have to grow up and understand ये बात क्या है. ये लड़ाई की बात है. This is a war we are fighting. This is not a polite discussion. And I would only say one thing about Sheldon Pollock. He's a rascal. वही बात है. He's a rascal. The reason why he goes on about Sanskrit cosmopolis, because he wants to question the underlying unity of the civilization. It's called Sanskrit is not a language. It is much more. The great High Court Judge Kuldeep Singh presided over a case in which they wanted parity between Persian and Sanskrit. And he replied, Sanskrit is the lifeblood of our civilization. His career ended after that, by the way. He didn't go beyond the High Court. Great man, a truly great man. He was a Sikh judge, so he was tough. Now, language defines everything about our culture. And as Ferdinand de Saussure, Derrida, Wittgenstein, Frege have all affirmed, and all now standard stuff in philosophy, language is simply not a means of communication. It defines who you are. So this attack on Sanskrit is very sly and very important. They are trying to say, okay, we do not have territorial unity in India for much of the period, except for the Maurya, much greater expanse. But we never lost our shared civilization consciousness. This is what they're trying to question. Say, kabhi tha nahi, and it is gone, and the tone is celebratory, which is why I'm appalled that he was the general editor of the Clay series and now the Murti series. That this person is not a friend of India, and I think there are too many of them. I'll give you one small example, which none of you will know. There's a book written by the grandnephew of Subhash Bose on Kashmir. In that book, he says, Governor Jagmohan was responsible for the expulsion of the Pandits. But this is factually incorrect, because he came to Srinagar on the 25th of January, and the expulsion started on the 22nd, and in between there were no communications. And when he came, he declared a curfew and shot 100 people. So this man, sitting there, he got promoted, by the way, straight away to full chair. He says Jagmohan was responsible, and fascinatingly, the Millennium Journal of the department, the reviewer said, this does not sound plausible. So we have to understand, we are not playing some game. This is earnest, serious, and deadly, and it must be fought like a war. And I'm afraid much has happened in the last decade, much to applaud and much to be reassured by, but we still have a long way to go. So ye kitab kabhi nahi aayega. I guarantee it will never, it will never be in any reading list. That's how you kill it. And you know, why do people write stupid books about India? Very simple. You come into a room, everybody's speaking French. You ain't going to get anywhere speaking German or Urdu. You have to speak French. And that dialogue is a particular discourse on Indian history. So you want to participate in the stream, you join that discourse. Secular, liberal, Hindutva, fascism, all this has to automatically feed in for to be heard. Journals will not publish you. I know of a very, very fine article by actually Dhulipala. It got published in Pakistan. Nobody would touch it.
No, that's not true. I mean, Venkat's book is has been widely read. Unfortunately, it has not been appreciated by the professional historians. It's had a greater response among ordinary people in writing it. And it's a book which people cannot ignore, because it demolishes the theory, which is an expedient one, that the movement for Pakistan grew out of some derailment of the Cripps mission and the cabinet mission plan, etc. That it seeks to establish, it suggests that the roots of the Pakistan movement were far deeper and were based on certain Islamic, political Islamic concepts.
Actually, I'm only referring to the swinging critique of Faisal's Dej's review, which was published in the Pakistani journal. Nobody would touch it in Western Europe or the US. So that's where it got published. So anyway, about the book, I agree. I agree. It has had an impact, definitely. And impact will continue.
Ladies and gentlemen, once again, I would like to thank the panelists, Shri Swapan Das Gupta, Dr. Gautam Sen, Shri Chaitanya Prasad, Shri Amish Tripathi, and the author, Shri Shashi Ranjan Kumar. You have been a wonderful audience. Thank you so much for your presence and support towards the book.